They say the chapel never burned. On the outskirts of Willow Creek, down a sloping path that cuts through the maple groves, the Holloway family's chapel still stands, a structure worn by time and covered in ivy, yet untouched by flame. Everyone remembers the night of the fire in 1921. Smoke filled the air, neighbors rushed with buckets. The roof groaned like a creature in pain. And yet when dawn arrived, there were no ashes. The wood was intact, and every candle remained upright, unlit but warm to the touch, as if something had burned, without ever catching fire. This was the first thing Eleanor Holloway learned not to ask about. At 17, she had eyes that saw more than she spoke. Her world was a careful one, balanced between rows of cornfields and the sermons of her father, Reverend Silas Holloway. She had lived her entire life on the Holloway estate, the family home beside the chapel, where everything smelled of iron and lavender. Her mother, Judith, hung linens that never seemed to dry. Her brother, Thomas, was always late for supper and always laughing when he arrived. But that was before he vanished. Now the laughter had gone silent. The linens hung still, no longer dancing in the breeze, and the chapel loomed larger, like a shadow that had grown teeth. Eleanor would often find herself drawn to its heavy doors, especially in the early hours when the mist hadn't yet lifted. Something pulled at her, a feeling, or maybe a sound. She once thought she heard whispering from inside, like someone praying without breath, but her father told her the building was empty. "God doesn't speak in riddles," he said. "If you hear riddles, child, it's the devil listening." Still, Eleanor knew what she heard. There was something in that chapel, something watching, something waiting. Her dreams had changed, too. She dreamed of wax melting without heat, of pews bleeding from their corners, of Thomas standing in the aisle, eyes black and mouth sealed shut. When she awoke, she would find her bedsheets cold, even in July. Once, she found a candle beside her pillow, unlit but slick with dew. She didn't tell her parents. Judith, her mother, barely spoke anymore. Since Thomas disappeared, she moved as if underwater. Her hands stitched crosses into napkins, pillowcases, curtains. When Eleanor asked why, Judith simply said, "To keep them away." "Who?" Eleanor whispered. But Judith just returned to her sewing. The town had stopped asking questions. People from Willow Creek used to visit the chapel for Sunday service. They stopped coming after the fire. Rumors spread quickly, stories about curses, blood in the baptismal font, and prayers that echoed too long after they'd been said. Reverend Silas dismissed them as cowardice. "We are the last pure ones," he preached. "Let the world burn with its lies. We, the Holloways, stand in God's quiet light." And yet, the chapel never held light. No candles, no lanterns, no electricity. Eleanor had never seen it truly lit. Her father insisted it was divine will. "If the flame doesn't catch, it means the spirit is present," he told her. She wanted to believe him. But belief isn't something you can force into silence. It stirs, it scratches. She remembered the night she snuck into the chapel alone. The doors creaked like old bones. The air inside was colder than outside. The pews stood straight, unwelcoming. On the altar, 12 candles sat in perfect order. She reached out, touched one, and jerked back. It was warm, no matches, no flame, and yet the wax pulsed like it was alive. She stepped back, heart pounding. Behind her, the door creaked again. No wind, no footsteps, just the creak, long, slow, like someone entering or leaving. She ran. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to find the same candle on her desk. No soot, no wick burned, but it was still warm. They say the chapel never burned. But Eleanor was beginning to think that wasn't quite true. And if the flames had no fire, what had they consumed? If you want to uncover what lies beneath the Holloways chapel, subscribe to the channel and follow this chilling tale. It's only just begun. The Holloway household was governed by silence. Each morning began before the sun. Reverend Silas would open the family Bible and read aloud in a tone that demanded attention, but offered no warmth. Eleanor sat stiffly beside her mother, while Judith folded her hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. No one interrupted. No one questioned. The word came first, and feelings were for weaker souls. At breakfast, conversation was measured in nods and gestures. Words were to be used sparingly. Silas believed that idle talk invited wickedness. The mouth opens the gate, he often warned, but it is the heart that swings it wide. There were rules, and they were etched into Eleanor's skin like old bruises. No shoes in the chapel, no mirrors in the house, no music after dusk, and absolutely no candles lit within the home. The only source of light permitted indoors after dark was a single oil lamp kept in the main room, trimmed so low it barely chased away the shadows. Eleanor once asked why. Silas didn't look up from his scripture. Because fire answers to more than men. It remembers who commands it. She never asked again. The nights were hardest. When the wind howled through the rafters and the house seemed to breathe, Eleanor often stared at the dark corners of the ceiling and wondered if God could really see them through so much silence. She wanted to believe her father, that they were the chosen, the last pure ones. But why did being chosen feel so much like being trapped? Judith moved like a ghost through their days. She cooked, cleaned, sewed, and prayed without pause. Her eyes were always downcast. Eleanor remembered a time when her mother hummed lullabies while kneading bread, her voice soft and sweet like warm sugar. Now, there was only silence. Sometimes, Eleanor caught her whispering things under her breath that didn't sound like prayers. Words too fast, too frantic, like she was trying to finish before someone heard. Silas never mentioned Thomas. Even after the boy vanished, Silas continued as if nothing had changed. No public search, no calls for help, no tears. He strayed from the doctrine, he said once, and that was the end of it. In sermons, he began referring to lost branches and tainted vessels. His messages grew darker, his tone harsher. The townsfolk who still came to hear him preach dwindled by the week. Some left mid-sermon, others stopped coming altogether. Eleanor noticed that even in the dwindling pews, Silas never wavered. He spoke with the same fire he always had, but that fire no longer warmed. It scorched. His eyes no longer searched for approval or understanding. They looked past people as if waiting for someone else to arrive. One Sunday, after a sermon that lasted over 2 hours, Silas declared that the world was entering its purification, that only those who denied false comfort would survive the coming rot. He ended with a line Eleanor had never heard before. The light that burns without flame is the only light left unstained. Afterward, Eleanor found herself alone in the chapel. Her hand brushed one of the unlit candles. It was cool, hollow. At dinner, she asked her father what he meant. He stared at her a moment too long. Then he spoke. Most light comes from suffering. The candles, you know, the ones the world trusts, they burn themselves into ash, but the light we keep, it does not die to shine. Eleanor swallowed hard. But what makes it shine, then? He smiled. It wasn't kind. Obedience. And that was the end of the conversation. That night, Eleanor sat by the oil lamp, watching its dim flicker. It danced weakly, like it didn't want to be seen. She imagined what it would be like to light a candle, just one, and let it blaze until it melted completely. To see something give all of itself without fear of what remained. Instead, she turned it down further and let the darkness reclaim the room. And in that darkness something stirred, something silent, but listening. Thomas Holloway vanished on a Thursday. The sun had risen like it always did, heavy with fog, casting long grey shadows across the field. Eleanor remembered the way the dew clung to the window, blurring the edges of the world. Thomas had finished his chores late, boots muddy, hands scratched from clearing the brambles near the chapel's fence. He tossed his coat over a chair and winked at Eleanor during breakfast, mouth full of bread. Going out to the barn, he mumbled, need to check the traps. Those were the last words he ever said. Hours passed. Then an afternoon. Then night. By dusk, Eleanor grew anxious. Her father said nothing. Judith sat sewing, thread trembling between her fingers. The air thickened with something Eleanor couldn't name. When the sun vanished and the fields turned black, she finally spoke. Should we look for him? Silas didn't lift his eyes from the Bible. He'll return when he's cleansed. No one moved. No one called his name. By morning, the barn stood empty. The traps were untouched. Thomas's coat remained on the chair, exactly where he'd left it. But the house felt colder. Not from weather, from absence. Eleanor searched the barn alone, stepping over hay piles and rusted tools. Nothing. No boot prints in the dirt. No signs of struggle. Just silence. And something else. At the back of the barn, beneath a rafter where Thomas used to carve his initials, Eleanor found ash. A small pile, dark and fine, pressed against the wall like it had been swept there. She knelt and touched it. Her fingers came away black. She said nothing. Back in the house, Judith moved differently, like her body was there, but her soul had stepped outside. She no longer stitched crosses. Instead, she stared at walls, hands folded, lips pressed in a line too tight to speak. Eleanor waited for her father to announce a search, to send word to the sheriff, to ride into town. But Silas only said, "We do not chase shadows. The Lord separates the wheat from the chaff." After that, Thomas's name was never spoken again. No search parties came. The Holloways had isolated themselves so long, few dared knock on their door. The town whispered, but no one acted. "That family's always been strange," one neighbor said. "Maybe the boy just ran off." But Eleanor knew better. That night, as the wind howled through the rafters, she sat in Thomas's room. It still smelled like him. Cedar oil, old tobacco, damp earth. His books remained untouched, his boots still under the bed. On the wall above his headboard, the wood bore a strange stain, like water damage, but blacker, almost oily. She reached out. It wasn't wet, but it hadn't always been there. At its center, someone had scratched a symbol, not letters, not numbers, a crude spiral etched into the grain, circling inward toward a dot. The mark pulsed faintly in the dim light, and when she blinked, she thought it had grown. Behind her, the floor creaked. She turned. Nothing. Her heart beat louder than her thoughts. She whispered, "Thomas." Silence. The candle on his desk, one of the family's hollow, fireless candles, sat exactly where he always kept it. She touched it, cold, but then warmth bloomed beneath her palm. Not burning, not glowing, just warmth. Like the heat left behind by a vanished body, she recoiled. The next morning she told her mother what she'd seen. Judith stared at her for a long time, then gently took her hands. "Some absences don't echo," she said softly. "They swallow." Eleanor wanted to scream, to tear down the chapel, to shout Thomas's name from the rooftops, but the house had rules, and breaking them meant stepping into the same darkness that had taken her brother. That night she dreamed of the barn, but in her dream it was no longer a barn. It was a mouth, yawning open in the earth, rimmed with wax and flame, and Thomas stood inside it, not waving, sir, but pointing toward her. Judith Holloway no longer spoke in full sentences. She moved like her joints ached, though she never complained. Her hair, once the color of polished chestnut, had faded to brittle grey, always bound tight in a bun that looked more like a knot of obligation than style. Eleanor watched her mother drift through their days like a shadow that had forgotten how to attach itself to a body. After Thomas's disappearance, Judith's hands worked even faster. She stitched from morning till night, dragging her needle through every cloth she could find. Napkins, pillowcases, towels, all bore the same symbol, a crooked cross, skewed to the left, always stitched in black thread. Eleanor asked once what it meant. Judith didn't answer. Her needle paused, hovering mid-air, and her lips pressed into a line so thin they disappeared. Then she kept sewing. There were nights Eleanor would wake to find her mother standing at the foot of her bed, silent, unmoving, fingers twitching as though still sewing even in sleep. When Eleanor stirred, Judith would simply turn and walk away, robes brushing against the hallway like whispers. Once Eleanor found her sitting on the porch long before dawn, barefoot, whispering something over and over. "They'll ask for the oldest, then the purest, then the one who stays." When Eleanor tried to approach, Judith stopped speaking and wouldn't meet her eyes for days. Inside the house, the air was heavy. It wasn't grief. It was a pressure, like the walls were listening. The clocks ticked louder than they used to. The stairs creaked more frequently, even when no one walked them. Judith began placing bowls of salt by every door and window. When Eleanor asked why, Judith replied without looking up, "To confuse the ones that come." No one had come. No one had knocked. No one had asked about Thomas in weeks. And yet Judith watched the trees like they might move closer. One afternoon, while cleaning the pantry, Eleanor found an old box wedged behind a loose board. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in her mother's handwriting. None had stamps. All were addressed to someone named Elias. She opened one. "They will take him if I don't choose. I've tried to reason with it. I've lit the candles, but the light won't hold." Another read, "The chapel has begun to hum again, like it remembers." Eleanor brought one of the letters to Judith. Her mother didn't flinch. She looked at the paper, then at her daughter, then quietly said, "I buried him with them. He wouldn't have left otherwise." Eleanor's throat closed. "Buried who?" Judith blinked. Her lips trembled. "Your brother." "But he—" Eleanor started, then stopped, because in that moment she saw something shift behind her mother's eyes. Not madness, not grief. Something older. Something rooted in knowing. Later that night, Eleanor entered her mother's sewing room. On the desk was a candle she hadn't seen before. It was shaped like a child curled into a fetal position, entirely wax with no wick. Its surface shimmered faintly, like oil on water. She reached out to touch it. Cold. When she turned it over, a name was etched into the base. Thomas. She didn't scream. Instead, she carried the candle back to her room, set it on her desk and stared at it until dawn. It never moved. It never warmed. But she swore she could hear something faint, the soft rustle of breath, like a whisper caught beneath layers of wax. The next day, Judith began sewing again, but this time, instead of crosses, she stitched spirals, each one tighter, each one deeper. And in the silence between stitches, Eleanor heard her mother hum for the first time in months. It wasn't a lullaby. It was a funeral hymn. Eleanor stood before the chapel again. It was just past midnight. The fog clung low to the ground, thick as wool, swallowing her footsteps. The air had the stillness of something watching. The wooden door loomed taller than she remembered, worn smooth by decades of touchless reverence. She hesitated, one hand pressed flat against the wood, and then she pushed. It opened with a sigh. Inside, the chapel was colder than the air outside. The pews stood in orderly lines, untouched by dust, as though someone still cleaned them. Eleanor's breath fogged in front of her as she stepped forward, boots echoing off the stone floor. She hadn't lit a lamp. She brought no matches. But still, the altar glowed. 12 candles lined the front rail, same as always, unlit, wax untouched. Yet the space around them shimmered faintly, casting gentle light with no visible source, not golden, not warm. A sickly, silvery pallor, like moonlight filtered through smoke. Eleanor moved closer, heart thudding. She reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed the nearest candle. It pulsed. Not heat, not movement, but something else. A presence, subtle and unshakable, like it was aware of her touch. She yanked her hand back and stepped away, breathing hard. Behind her, the door creaked shut. No wind. No draft. Just the slow groan of old hinges. Closing. She turned. No one was there. Yet the chapel felt occupied, not crowded, but observed. A silence filled the room that wasn't empty. It was pregnant with memory. The pulpit was bare. No Bible, no symbols. Just wood, worn smooth, and the faint outline of a spiral etched into its center. The same shape Eleanor had seen stitched into her mother's cloth, the same design scorched into Thomas's wall. She stared at it too long. Something shifted in the walls. Not a sound, not exactly. More a pressure, a low hum just beneath hearing, like a choir holding its breath. And then, a voice. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor spun. An old woman stood at the end of the front pew, nearly lost in the shadows. Her frame was wrapped in a brown shawl, her hair long and white, falling in frayed strands. Her face was sunken but alert, eyes sharp despite the years. Eleanor began, her throat dry. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She walked slowly toward the altar, keeping her eyes on the candles. "They never burned," she said quietly. "Not in the way you think." Eleanor stepped between her and the flickering glow. "What do you mean?" The woman looked at her, eyes like storm glass. "Because they were never meant to give light. They were meant to keep something in." Silence. Then Eleanor whispered, "What's in them?" The woman studied her a long time, then asked, "What happened to your brother?" Eleanor's chest tightened. "He disappeared." "No," the woman said. "He was taken, like the others." Eleanor shook her head. "You're wrong." "I watched them bring the first one in," the woman continued. "Years ago. The fire came, but it did not burn. The flames whispered." Took a name. Left the face. Her voice dropped lower. "Every candle is a name, every name is a seal." Eleanor backed away from the altar. "You need to leave." "I've already stayed too long," the woman replied. She turned toward the door. But before stepping out, she paused. "They'll ask you to choose," she said softly. "They always do, the blood knows." And then she was gone. Eleanor stood alone, surrounded by cold light, heart hammering. She turned to the candles again. They stood motionless, wax perfect, flames invisible. Yet in their glow, she could almost see faces, faint, flickering, buried in the wax, eyes closed, mouths sealed. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The chapel had taken her voice. Mrs. Byrne didn't knock when she returned. Eleanor found her in the garden at dawn, kneeling beside the rosemary bush, pulling weeds with the calm of someone who belonged there. Her shawl was dusted with dew, her eyes sunken but alert. She looked up as Eleanor approached and said, "The ground remembers more than the people do." Eleanor crouched beside her, heart still knotted from the night before. "You knew about the chapel?" Mrs. Byrne nodded. "Knew it before it was stone." The morning was heavy with mist. Birds didn't sing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "What lives in there?" The old woman took a long time to answer. Her fingers traced the soil as if drawing something lost. "It started in 1853, she finally said, "before the Holloways built that chapel. Back when Willow Creek was just a patch of farms and prayer meetings. The land had no name then, but something lived in the earth, deep, ancient, and hungry." Eleanor shivered. "Hungry for what?" "Names," Mrs. Byrne replied. "Blood, and most of all, silence." She explained that the first Holloways, a man and woman newly wed, settled where the chapel now stood. They built a small wooden structure to hold their ceremonies, but something went wrong. A fire broke out during a spring service. No one saw how it started. The air filled with smoke, but the flames never reached the wood. The heat was there, the pain was there, but the building remained untouched, except for the people. "Everyone inside was found later," Mrs. Byrne said softly. "Still whole, but hollow, like their voices had been scraped out." Eleanor's breath caught. "What happened to them?" "They were buried in secret. The town called it a fever, but the Holloways knew. They sealed the place and swore never to speak of it. But their child, their only child, didn't agree." "The Reverend," Eleanor said, realization dawning. Mrs. Byrne nodded. "He grew up hearing the whispers. He reopened the structure, changed it, carved prayers into its bones, made pacts." Eleanor stared at the garden, the soil suddenly darker, wetter. "What kind of pacts?" "To contain it, to redirect it. They offered something in return." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Like what?" Mrs. Byrne looked her in the eye. "Family. Always family. A bloodline is a promise if you make it loud enough." The words hit like a blow. Eleanor wanted to deny it, to reject every part of what she was hearing, but it made sense. The silence, the rituals, the vanishing of Thomas. The glowless candles. The chapel is a seal, Mrs. Byrne continued. Each candle a name buried. The fire is not fire. It's hunger made still. But it doesn't stay still forever. Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady. Then how do we stop it? You don't stop the earth, the old woman said gently. You survive it, or you're swallowed. Eleanor turned toward the house. Her mother was watching from the window, eyes distant. She knew, Eleanor whispered. She did, said Mrs. Byrne. She always did. Silence stretched long between them. There's still time, Mrs. Byrne added, voice softer now. But not much. The chapel hums louder in the fall. The veil grows thin. Eleanor stepped away, mind spinning, breath shallow. Behind her, the old woman called out once more. Child? Eleanor turned. They'll want a name again soon. When they come, don't give them yours. And with that, she vanished down the path, her feet making no sound. Eleanor stood alone, the wind finally stirring, brushing her skin like breath. She looked toward the chapel, where the mist curled against the walls like fingers. The candles would not stay quiet much longer. The dreams returned that night. Eleanor saw Thomas standing at the edge of the chapel, barefoot in the frost, his face pale and mouth stitched shut. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his eyes, hollow as the candles, stared through her, pleading. She tried to run to him, but her feet sank into wax, thick, warm, rising up her legs like mud. The air pulsed with whispers, not in words, but in rhythm, a heartbeat of voices. When she awoke, her room smelled faintly of burnt cotton. The candle, shaped like Thomas, was gone. She searched everywhere, pulled her bedding apart, checked under the floorboards. Nothing. Judith said nothing when Eleanor asked, just stared at her, lips moving silently, eyes bloodshot from a night without rest. Later that day, Eleanor confronted her in the hallway. You know something. Judith hesitated. Her hand trembled against the banister. He wanted to stop it. Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas? Judith nodded slowly. He found the old books, the ones hidden in the root cellar. He read them, too much. He asked too many questions. He wanted to unmake the candles. Her voice cracked on the last word. You let him go, Eleanor said, barely above a whisper. No. Judith's eyes filled. I begged him not to. But once you hear the chapel, once it knows your name, Eleanor clenched her fists. You didn't stop him. Judith stepped closer, reached for her daughter's face. You don't understand what it takes to keep this house safe. What it costs. Eleanor stepped back. I understand that he's gone, she said, and that we all keep pretending he never existed. Judith's voice dropped to a whisper. Because speaking his name opens the door again. That night, Eleanor returned to the root cellar. She dug through broken crates, mildew-soaked sacks, and finally uncovered a bundle wrapped in oilskin. Inside were the journals, pages brittle, ink faded, notes in Latin, margins filled with Thomas's handwriting, sketches of candles with names beneath, spirals, symbols burned into wax. References to fireless flame, rituals requiring silence, and one line underlined twice, to silence the fire, you must know its true name. Hours later, Eleanor sat on her bed, journal in her lap, candlelight flickering beside her. Thomas's voice echoed in her head, not a memory but something deeper, as if his thoughts had been bound to the ink. They bury them in light, it said. But the light is not mercy. It's a lid. She closed the book. She knew what she had to do. The next morning she returned to the chapel. But before she reached the door, a figure blocked her path. Judith. You can't go back, her mother said. It's listening now. Eleanor met her gaze, then let it listen. Judith's expression broke. You don't know what it asked me. What it promised if I stayed quiet. Eleanor's voice was steady. Then tell me now. Silence. Then, with a whisper, Judith spoke. It said Thomas could live if I gave up my voice. Eleanor blinked. You... what? Judith touched her own throat. I haven't spoken to it since, but it still comes. Every year, every autumn, it asks for another. Her hands fell to her sides. Thomas wasn't supposed to be next. The truth settled like snow, and Eleanor realized Thomas hadn't been taken blindly. He had chosen to step toward the fire, trying to end it before it reached her, and now it was her turn to choose. She walked past her mother, toward the chapel, toward the hum that waited behind the wood, because the time for silence had ended. And something was ready to speak again. Reverend Silas Holloway sat at the dining table, hands clasped, Bible open but unread. He had not looked up when Eleanor entered. His eyes remained fixed on the text, lips moving in silent prayer, as if he could ward off her presence by sheer devotion. The air between them was taut, the kind that stretched but refused to break. Eleanor stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath her. "I know what happened to Thomas." Silas's hands tightened. Still, he didn't speak. He found the truth. About the chapel. About the fire that doesn't burn. About what you sealed beneath it. Silas raised his gaze slowly. His eyes, once commanding, now held something far colder, resignation wrapped in steel. "You speak of things you do not understand," he said. "I understand enough," Eleanor replied, "that he tried to stop it, that you let it take him." Silas stood. His voice, when it came, was low but sharp. He wandered from the path. He questioned order. He dared to unbind the covenant. Eleanor's chest tightened. "He was your son." "He was a sacrifice," Silas said. "And so are we all." The words dropped like stones. Eleanor stepped back, but she didn't waver. "Is that what you call obedience? Giving your own blood to something you pretend is holy?" Silas moved around the table, closing the space between them. "You think I wanted this?" he said, voice rising. "You think I chose this burden? I was born into it, as you were, as he was. You do not sever a chain by running from it. You chain it tighter by saying nothing," she said, "by letting it feed." He laughed once, bitter, cracked. "Feed? You still don't see. This land was cursed long before we ever arrived. We are not the cause, Eleanor. We are the seal. Our silence is the only thing that holds it back." She stared at him. "And what happens when the seal fails?" His mouth twitched. "Then the candles go out." Eleanor's skin chilled. "I've seen them," she said. "The faces inside. They're not light. They're people." "They're vessels," Silas said, "bound by names and obedience. If they remained unburned, they remained whole. That is mercy." She shook her head. "You worship it." "I fear it," he whispered. Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't empty. The walls seemed to lean closer, the very house tightening its grip around them. "I read Thomas's journal," Eleanor said finally. "He believed there was a way to break it." Silas's expression turned grim. "He was young. He believed too much." Eleanor stepped forward. "And what do you believe?" Silas didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the fireplace, where no flame had ever burned. He reached beneath the mantel and pulled free a small box, old, carved from blackwood, sealed with twine. Inside were 3 candles, not the family's usual featureless wax. These had names etched on them, names Eleanor recognized, her brother's, her mother's, and her own. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. "They're prepared," Silas said, voice barely audible. "For the night it asks again." Eleanor stared at him, horrified. "You kept me ready, like a tool." "A promise," he said. "Each generation must offer the next. That is the pact. And if we refuse, then it takes everything anyway," she finished. He didn't deny it. Eleanor took the candles and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Silas asked. "To break the chain." He said nothing, just lowered his head, resting it in his hands. As she stepped into the cold evening, the sky churned above, clouds thick and low, pressing down like a lid. Eleanor didn't flinch. She now knew what obedience had cost them, and what defiance might yet save. Winter came early that year. By late September, frost coated the windows of the Holloway home, though no snow had yet fallen. The air turned sharp, cutting through coats and hearths alike. Fires built in stoves sputtered and died without reason. Judith layered blankets over the beds, but the cold was not ordinary. It didn't bite, it pressed into lungs, into walls, into silence. The chapel, too, grew colder. Not visibly, but when Eleanor approached it, even during the day, her breath clouded in seconds. The grass near its foundation yellowed and snapped underfoot. No birds nested in its rafters. No squirrels crossed its path. And then the apparitions began. It started with faces. At dusk, Eleanor would glance from the kitchen and see them. Faint shapes at the chapel windows, not moving, not human. Features melted, waxen, like half-formed masks suspended in glass. They never blinked, they never watched, they merely existed. She counted 12. 12 candles. 12 faces, she told her mother. Judith said nothing, only stood from her chair and began placing salt again, across windowsills, across floorboards, around Eleanor's bed. "They're waking," she whispered. "The seal's fraying." "Then help me stop it," Eleanor said. Judith didn't answer, and still the cold deepened. At night, Eleanor heard whispers through the walls, not words, breath, not conversation, exhale. A room might feel empty, but the air always shifted as if someone else had just left. Doors opened without hinges groaning. Footsteps pattered with no source. One evening, Eleanor found a trail of wax drops leading from the back door to the cellar. She followed them. The light flickered low as she descended, and the steps groaned beneath her. At the bottom, the old prayer books were scattered across the floor, pages torn, spirals drawn on every surface. The air tasted like copper, and in the corner, near the old brine barrel, lay something small. A candle, not one of the 3 from the box. This one was different, twisted, blackened, deformed. A wick protruded from the top, and it was burning, but the flame was invisible. Only the heat told her it was real, a dry, radiating warmth like breath too close to skin. The candle didn't melt, it didn't change, but the flame remained, steady and unseen. She reached to touch it. A hand stopped her. Judith, her grip was iron, her eyes wild. "Don't," she said, voice breaking. "If you touch it, it sees you." Eleanor pulled back. "What is it?" "A message," Judith replied. "Or a warning. It means it's inside again." That night, Judith collapsed. Eleanor found her at the foot of the stairs, eyes wide, skin damp with cold sweat. In her hand, clenched so tight the knuckles bled, was a candle, one of the named ones, not Eleanor's, not Thomas's, her own. Judith had taken her own name. She wouldn't wake. Eleanor placed her in bed, wrapped her in blankets, lit the stove. Nothing warmed her. Her breathing was shallow, her lips blue. In the hallway, the oil lamp guttered. A draught swept through the room, though no windows were open, and from the chapel across the field a sound emerged. Not a cry, a hum, low, layered, deep as roots and wide as the night sky. It vibrated through the wood of the house, through the bones of the floor, through the marrow in Eleanor's spine. She walked to the window. The chapel windows glowed, faintly like distant stars under water. Each one pulsed in rhythm with the hum. 12 pulses, 12 windows, 12 faces. She stepped back from the glass, and from the hallway behind her, a voice whispered her name. It wasn't her mother, it wasn't her brother, and it wasn't alone. Eleanor waited until the second hour before dawn. The chapel lights had dimmed, but the hum remained, low, constant, like a warning held just beneath hearing. Judith still hadn't stirred. Her body felt lighter in Eleanor's arms, like warmth had long since abandoned it. She placed one of the named candles beside her mother's bed, not knowing whether it offered protection or threat. Then she took the other 2 and went out. The frost didn't touch her skin anymore. The cold felt internal now, not from wind but from knowing. She crossed the field in silence. The door to the chapel opened before she touched it. Inside, the light was wrong. The 12 candles still lined the altar, unlit yet glowing with that muted silver sheen. But something had changed. Their glow had spread. Thin threads of wax running along the floorboards, branching out like roots curling toward the pews and walls. Something underneath was stirring. Eleanor walked down the aisle, each step echoed by the groan of wood not built to bend. When she reached the altar, she placed the 2 remaining candles on its surface, her own and Thomas's, side by side. Then she dropped to her knees and began to pry at the boards. They resisted. But the closer she got to the center, the more the air throbbed, as if breath moved below her. She peeled back layers of wax and dust, her nails tearing, splinters cutting her fingers until she found it. A hatch, crude, iron-rimmed, sealed with wax, and at its center, a spiral carved deep, older than the chapel itself. She reached for it. A voice, not heard but felt. "You know the shape." She froze. Then, steadied by some memory of Thomas, his laugh, his stubbornness, she pressed her palm against the spiral. It fit. With a shudder, the hatch cracked open. Below was a pit. No ladder. No floor in sight, just blackness that felt dense, full of sound not yet born. And in that space, a box. Stone, etched with names. Holloway, Elias, Judith, Thomas, Eleanor, and beneath the names, smaller ones, dozens, maybe more. Some worn away, some recent. She climbed down slowly, inch by inch, her feet landing on cold stone. The box opened without force. Inside were pages, journals bound in flesh-toned leather, ink-smeared, symbols unfamiliar and wrong. She turned one over. The language was not human, but beneath the incomprehensible scrawl Thomas had written translations. They burned them to keep them still, but wax does not forget what fire never touches. Another entry. Each candle holds a name, each name seals a soul. The light is a lid, the spiral is the lock. To break the chain, you must break the silence. Eleanor turned the page. Speak the name, speak the flame, and offer truth in its place. She knelt. The altar above trembled. Something was coming awake. With shaking hands, she pulled her candle from her pocket. She whispered, "Eleanor Holloway." The wax heated. She whispered, "I am not the seal. I am the voice." The candle split down the middle. A sound echoed through the pit. Not scream, not song, but the exhale of something ancient, relieved. Then she lit the wick. It burned. Real flame. The first true fire the chapel had seen in generations. Above, the candles flickered. The silver glow trembled. The roots of wax along the floor curled and withdrew like severed limbs. She climbed back to the altar. The hatch sealed behind her. The chapel was no longer silent. And in that sudden breath, that shift in the air, Eleanor knew, the names had been heard, the chain had been marked, and the fire, for the first time, was listening. The flame did not go out. Eleanor watched it flicker on the altar, a real flame at last, not cold, not illusion. It moved with breath, danced with the air, casting warm shadows across the chapel walls. For a long moment she simply stood there, stunned by the sheer possibility of change. Then the whispers began to fade, not disappear, just retreat, as if the thing beneath had pulled back, uncertain now of its hold. She left the chapel before sunrise. Outside, the frost had thinned. The ground, though still stiff with cold, no longer cracked beneath her steps. The wind moved through the trees with sound again, a rustle, a real rustle. She ran home. Judith lay still in bed, her breath now steady, no longer shallow. The candle Eleanor had left beside her was gone. In its place, a circle of wax surrounded her hand, melted, pale, cool. Eleanor sat beside her. "I lit it," she said softly. "I broke the silence. I used my name." Judith's eyes opened. They didn't widen, they didn't flinch. She only blinked and whispered, "Then it's listening now." Eleanor nodded. "And I need to speak louder." Later that day, she went to Father Matthias. The priest had grown quiet in recent years, driven back from town by dwindling faith and the shadow of Silas's doctrine. He lived in a stone rectory near the river, tending to forgotten books and older truths. When Eleanor knocked, he opened the door without question. "I need your help," she said. "I figured you would," he replied, stepping aside. They sat by the hearth, the first true fire Eleanor had felt in weeks. She explained everything: the candles, the altar, the journals, the hatch, the pact. Matthias listened without interruption. His face remained calm, though his hands curled into fists as she spoke. "It's old," he said when she finished. "Older than Scripture. Older than the stones under this land. But can it be undone?" "Not undone," he said, "but rewritten. If the seal is faith, then counter it with truth. If silence was its strength, then voice must be the weapon." He handed her a book. Not a Bible, not holy, but real, full of forgotten names, burned prayers, recorded rituals, none of them sanctioned. "You'll need to say it," he said, "all of it, with no one left to fear it." "I'm ready," she answered. But she wasn't. That night, back at the house, she found her father waiting at the edge of the chapel. He didn't move when she approached. "I lit it," she said. "I know," he replied. "You felt it?" "I did." They stood in silence. "It doesn't have to take more," she continued. "We can break it." Silas looked at her. His eyes, though sunken and weary, held no hate, only grief. "It already took everything," he whispered. "Then let me give it something else," she said. "Not blood, not silence, truth." He nodded once. She stepped past him, into the chapel. The air welcomed her this time. The flame on the altar was waiting. She set the book down. She opened the first page, and she began to speak. Each word cracked like thunder. Each name burned through the walls like fire through parchment. The chapel trembled, not in pain but in response. It was listening, and for the first time it was learning. Eleanor did not stop, not when her voice shook, not when her hands bled from clutching the pages, not when her father knelt behind her in prayer, not to the thing beneath, but to the truth above. And outside, the frost melted, and within, the chains loosened, because Eleanor had chosen not to be the seal, but to be the flame. The night Eleanor lit the final flame, the valley held its breath. No winds moved. No stars pierced the clouded sky. Willow Creek, so long silent under a shadow it could not name, waited in a stillness deeper than winter. Eleanor stood at the chapel altar, her hands outstretched. The candle burned cleanly now, no wax drip, no flicker. A steady, unwavering blaze. One by one she took the remaining named candles and brought them to flame. Judith's, Thomas's, her own. Each caught fire instantly, not violently. Not with crackle or heat, but with certainty. The altar shook, the silver glow receded, and the wax roots that had choked the floor shriveled into themselves, curling like paper over flame. A sound rose then, not a scream, but a hum turned inside out. The seal was breaking, not from defilement, but from release. Something ancient, caged and fed through silence, was being called not to devour, but to listen. Eleanor stepped forward. She opened the book Father Matthias had given her and recited from the old tongue. Not words she understood, but names. Names the chapel had taken. Names never buried. Names held still in wax for generations. The pews cracked. The spiral on the pulpit glowed red. Then, movement. From the far wall a panel split with a sound like wood sobbing. Behind it a stairwell descending. She knew the moment had come. With the 3 flames carried in hollow candle holders, Eleanor walked downward, into the earth beneath the chapel. The walls were coated in wax and smooth and veined like tree bark. Her footsteps left no echo, only warmth. The deeper she went, the warmer the space became. And then she saw them, figures, dozens, lined in silent vigil, not corpses, not statues, shapes of wax, human in outline, featureless in face, each with a candle embedded in their chest, each with a name carved across their base, and in the center, Thomas, still and still breathing. His eyes opened as she approached, but he did not speak. Eleanor raised her candle and held it to his. For a moment nothing happened, then his candle caught, not with fire, but with color, red, gold, blue. His lips parted, no sound emerged, but she heard it all the same. "Thank you." Behind her, other candles lit themselves, one by one. The wax figures shuddered, not in horror, in relief. They were being seen, heard, released. Eleanor turned and lifted her voice once more. "This chapel was not a prison. It was a promise. You were not meant to burn, you were meant to shine." The flames responded. Above, the chapel's bell rang for the first time in 50 years, one long, mournful tone. The earth shifted, the spiral cracked, and something vast exhaled. Eleanor closed the book. The figures began to melt, not dissolve, but transform. As the wax fell away, bodies emerged. Faces returned, breath flowed. They stepped from the walls not as spirits but as people, returned. Thomas walked to her, whole. He touched her shoulder. "You broke it," he said, voice real. "No," she answered. "We rewrote it." Together, they walked back up. The stairwell closed behind them, and outside, dawn waited. But Eleanor knew her work wasn't done. One candle still burned, her own. And it would remain so, a vigil, not of silence but of truth. The wind returned with the sunrise. It swept through Willow Creek like breath after drowning. Sudden, wide, alive. The frost that had lingered for weeks vanished beneath its warmth. The grass uncurled, the trees swayed. And the chapel's doors, long heavy and stiff with secrets, stood open for the first time since Eleanor could remember. Inside, silence shattered. Not with chaos, but with sound, pure, resonant, holy. Eleanor stood at the center of the aisle, her candle still burning, the book still open in her arms. Around her the wax forms had vanished. No more hollow figures, no more sealed mouths. Only air and light and the scent of cedar and old stone. And then came the voice. "Why?" It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It was Silas. He stood in the doorway, robes twisted in the wind, eyes wild. Not from madness, but from recognition. The chapel he'd guarded, the silence he'd preserved, the ritual he'd enforced, broken, undone, unwritten by his own blood. He stepped forward. "Do you understand what you've done?" Eleanor turned to face him, calm. "I gave them back their names." Silas's face contorted. They were chosen, preserved. "They were imprisoned," she said. "You taught us obedience, but it was never obedience. It was fear." He looked at the altar, the candles, the spiral now cracked and dark. "There are forces we are not meant to challenge." She took a step toward him. "And there are truths we are not meant to bury." He raised his hand, not in violence but in prayer, a trembling gesture toward the rafters, toward the old gods, or new. "You've opened it," Eleanor nodded. "And I've spoken into it." He fell to his knees. The wind howled through the broken, stained glass. Judith appeared in the doorway behind him. She didn't speak. She walked past him, and for the first time in years, she stood beside Eleanor. "Say it," she whispered to her husband. Silas didn't move. Judith took his hand and pressed it to the altar. "Say his name." His lips trembled. "Thomas," he whispered. The flame on the final candle roared, blue and gold and white. And in its blaze, a sound unlike any before filled the chapel. Not a scream, not a cry, but a song. Low, human, beautiful. The sound of the wax breaking, the chain falling, the seal lifted. Silas wept, and behind the tears was not pain, but release. Judith held him, and Eleanor closed the book. As the song faded, Eleanor felt it, the last breath of the old force slipping back into the deep earth. Not banished, not destroyed, but known, heard, freed from the hunger silence had sharpened for generations. Outside the bell rang again, once, then again, 12 times in total. Each chime a name returned, each toll a vow renewed. The Holloways did not speak as they stepped into the morning, but they no longer needed silence to keep the chapel still. Truth had filled its halls. And in that truth, fire had finally found voice. The flames didn't stop. Even after the names were spoken, after the wax dissolved and the bell fell silent, the chapel remained lit, not with illusion, not with hunger, but with fire that breathed like truth. It clung to the rafters, curled around the altar, danced across the walls. Not once did it burn. It warmed. It healed. Eleanor stood in its center, candle still in hand, the last vestige of the old pact now transformed. Her name no longer sealed her fate. It liberated it. Outside, the town began to stir. For the first time in decades, people returned to Willow Creek's chapel, drawn not by fear but by wonder. They came in silence, unsure, hesitant. But when they stepped inside and saw the flame, real and radiant, their eyes widened with something nearly forgotten. Hope. Judith welcomed them. Thomas stood at her side, his body restored, his voice quiet but sure. He remembered everything, the taking, the silence, the hollow waiting. But he no longer feared it. He had lived through the void and returned with his name intact. And Silas was gone. No one saw him leave. No one saw where he went. Only his Bible remained on the pulpit, open to a page unmarked. As the sun crested over the valley, Eleanor returned to the field behind the chapel. The soil there, once hard and cold, was soft again, alive. She dug with her hands, no tools, until she found them. Bones, old, fragile, dozens, wrapped in linen, tied with string. The ones buried without rites, without words, without names. She lifted each one gently and carried them to the chapel. No one asked what she was doing. They simply made space. Together the town formed a line, from field to altar, and one by one, Eleanor placed the remains at the foot of the flame. Each time she whispered a name. Some she had read in the journals, others came to her in dreams. Others still were spoken by those who remembered. Faint echoes passed from grandmother to child, neighbor to neighbor. And each time a name was given, the flame grew. Not wilder, brighter. Beneath the chapel, the spiral no longer hummed. The pit had sealed itself. The walls bore no more wax, only stone. Judith walked the aisles with salt in hand, but no longer out of fear. She scattered it as blessing now, a ritual not of protection but of peace, and Eleanor lit the final candle. A single wick, no name. She set it on the altar. "For the one who still waits," she whispered. The flame caught. It pulsed once, and then the chapel was still. Outside bells rang not from towers but from hand and voice. The people of Willow Creek sang, a hymn not written in any book but known in the marrow. It rose like wind, spread like fire, and wrapped the town in its embrace. And in that moment, Eleanor felt it. The Holloways had changed the story, not with power, with light. Not with obedience, with courage, not with silence, with flame. That evening, as the sun sank low, Eleanor walked the chapel alone one last time. The walls, now etched with names, bore no shadows, the pews no longer creaked, and the altar burned, gently, forever. She placed the journals at its base and let them turn to ash, not erased, released. Behind her the door stood open. And for the first time in a century, the chapel no longer needed to be watched. It watched no one, because it had finally been seen, because it had finally burned, and nothing had been lost in the fire. Years passed. The chapel no longer glowed with eerie light, no longer pulsed with silent dread. The spiral beneath the altar had faded into memory, its mark left only in stories. Grass grew wild where wax once spread. The field no longer hummed, but the names remained, carved into stone, etched into memory, whispered in lullabies passed between generations. Eleanor never left Willow Creek. She lived in the small house beyond the orchard, beside Mrs. Byrne, who outlived her own predictions and spent her final years sipping tea by the fire and muttering, "Took long enough, didn't it?" Children grew up hearing the tale, not as warning, but as legacy. They played near the chapel steps, their laughter ringing where fear once ruled. On certain days when the wind hit just right, they swore they could hear faint hymns from inside, not haunting but inviting. A song remembered. The altar remained intact. No priest tended it. No sermons filled the pews. But people came, not to confess, but to recall. They lit candles with real fire. They left notes at the base of the spiral stone. They read the names aloud. The Holloways were no longer feared. They were honored. Thomas became a teacher. He worked the land, read endlessly, and helped rebuild the town's forgotten archives. He never spoke much about the years he'd been gone, but sometimes, when the chapel glowed during storms, he would sit at the edge of the pews and watch the light without fear. Judith passed quietly one summer morning. She had spent her final years embroidering handkerchiefs with spirals turned outward, symbols of release, not binding. Her last words, whispered with peace, were, "It doesn't ask anymore." Eleanor carried the candle she had lit in the depths of the chapel until the day she died. It never went out. Its flame was passed to the town, to the children, to the chapel's walls. It became legend. On the chapel's front stone, a single line was carved, every candle burned, every soul released. And so the Holloways became something more than guardians of silence. They became keepers of light. Stories like theirs are easy to forget. They are not written in history books or taught in classrooms. They are passed in voice, in gesture, in ritual. They exist where names once burned without fire, and where silence once ruled with invisible chains. But if you ever find yourself in Willow Creek, if you ever step through the chapel door and feel the warmth where once there was none, you'll know. You'll remember. And if you speak the names, not in fear but in honor, they will answer. Not with whispers, but with flame. If this story stirred something in you, if the light of the Holloways still burns somewhere in your memory, don't let it fade. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next forgotten truth waiting to be uncovered. And if you're ready to journey deeper into the hidden histories that shaped the shadows of this world, click the video on your screen now, the one with the door slightly open and the candle just beginning to flicker. We'll meet you there.